Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Ms. Ward, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thank you for having me. My name is Christina Ward. I'm a food historian, food writer, as well as a publisher. I work in publishing, running a small independent publishing company, and work editing and doing all of that fun stuff. But my passion is the convergence of what we eat, how we eat it, why we eat it, and how that works into our very American history.
How did you get interested in food history?
Food history for me is someone growing up in the 70s, which was the prevalent era of box dinners and canned things, which is what my mom served. But yet, in summers, I'd go up to my paternal grandmother's farm and live very close to the land. It was a really eye-opening experience to see the difference of eating, a can of SpaghettiOs and then working, harvesting, cucumbers and strawberries and, managing the chickens and doing all of those things. And so for me, that really spurred that why. Why is it this way? Why are we eating one way in the city and one way in the country? So that was really the impetus as a kid to want to know more.
It brings in a whole question, even with agriculture. I know some people that are starting up organizations that are trying to get, I guess, small ag into giant cities, like community farms, or do something where it would help out with either supply issues or would help out with convenience factors, be able to give people beneficial farm organic stuff compared to just going to a store and getting stuff. But it is weird how cities are always like, I mean, I grew up in a somewhat of a city, and then going to my grandparents' house who live out in the middle of like the country, it was a completely different experience. The food was a lot more, I mean, it took longer to get to you compared to a 5 minute microwavable thing, but it was better. It was kind of more refreshing. And you start getting into it's got to be possible to be able to bring that into cities as well, too.
It absolutely is, and there's some amazing people who've been pioneering that in the past 20 years. Again, I'm in Milwaukee, and we have a very robust urban farm system of transforming vacant or abandoned houses in city lots and turning them into large market garden plots or small farm operations that then serve the neighborhoods. That's happening in Detroit, and it's happening in Chicago, and maybe it's us Rust Belters that lead that revolution, but it's definitely happening. And there's so much benefit to eating as local as you can. And this is kind of a little bit born out of what was called the slow food movement. Was started in Italy. This idea of recognizing regionality, locality, and what that does for both the social interaction, the difference of like 5 minutes spent eating dinner that was microwaved versus a family sitting down for an hour or two of enjoying dinner, enjoying their company. So there's so many different aspects of it. And then it gets into the health aspects of gut biomes, which is something that is really interesting and up for study, is that, each person is essentially their own ecosystem. We all have a different bacteria population living in our gut. And a lot of that came about as to where we were born, where we were living. Our gut biome changes over time, and it can be adjusted through chemicals. If for good, if some people are taking probiotics, and for bad, by taking highly, but if they're just eating highly processed foods or highly chemicalized foods, they're essentially killing their gut biome, which can account for food intolerances, food allergies, as well as just that kind of general like sour stomach. It means that the food you're taking in isn't agreeing or working in good symbiosis with your body's systems.
Now, how long, I guess, when did it first become new that we learned about the microbiome inside of ourselves? Like, I know the gut brain connection is relatively, I wouldn't say it's relatively new, but it is kind of new compared to like at least as long as we've known about the brain and also the stomach as well, too. I think that I learned about the gut connection like 3 or 4 years ago.
What's interesting is essentially the food science is a relatively new field if we think about it in the arc of human history. Vitamins were really just identified in the early 1900s. So these idea of the component structures of what make up food, we haven't really understood or known it for that long. And so then when you talk about the gut brain connection and all the biome research, this is a really relatively within the past couple decades is with the advances of measurement technologies, fMRI machines and in chemical analysis, DNA analysis. So those are some of the tools that have allowed researchers and scientists to understand better the functionality of what we're putting into our bodies and then how that affects our systems. So a lot of them really fascinating research in what your gut biomes and the brain gut connection is happening out at the University of California, at UC Davis, honestly. They're doing just incredible work on connecting um, essentially like babies being breastfed, babies being bottle fed, and what their gut biomes look like, and then tracking those children to find out, following their health issues throughout the year. So again, this is just brand new research that we will learn so much about how humans function in the next decade.
What would you say one of the most, I guess, important contributed factors into people wanting to understand more about their food is? I consider that one of the contributing factors. I think it's this like era that we're in today where it seems like everybody's having their own existential crisis. Some are, maybe some aren't, but I could speak. I am having my own existential crisis. I think most of my generation is having that as well too. Maybe that's just being in your 20s, but it is a factor of people that are wondering like, how do I take care of myself? How do I make sure I live as long as possible? That idea of immortality that has been throughout history, I guess, in people's mind of wanting to try and excel their life as long as possible, but also we're getting more ailments at a younger age. I don't know how many people I know that have digestive issues that are only in their 20s. And I don't think this was always like this, but you have more people that are concerned about looking into their food. And when that gut microbiome connection, that brain and gut connection came in, there's a lot of people that started getting interested in trying to find different diets and different trends to get in there. And to me, that was like just walking into a minefield because that whole history is, riddled with corporations and obviously business interests. So they're not honestly going to give you the truth. But then you kind of start diving into the history of it and it becomes more fascinating. I mean, the idea of breaking bread, that sounds like, okay, what does that mean? And that's a really hard sales pitch to sell a kid my age or maybe a little bit older. Like, hey, do family dinners. And it's like, why? I can go to my room and eat my food and have a streaming service. Like, it doesn't make sense. That whole capacity of using that to get people interested in like eating together, the real importance in that is being able to deload from your day. And so now with the gut brain connection, I go, well, now there's a real scientific health concern, not just history and the idea of breaking bread, but there's a real health concern when it comes to trying to understand what is going into your food and what you are putting into your body, which I feel like is one of the main motivators right now to at least get people to start diving into the tangled web of history of food.
It is, and as soon as the identification of, say, vitamins and the component elements of all food sources is as soon as those scientific studies came to public light, very quickly you saw fad diets. It was a concurrent rise, and where you got in the 1920s and some of the more ridiculous diets kind of came about. And what's interesting is to see them circle back, decades and decades later, something like the grapefruit diet that became really popular. It got put forward by someone who was just, again, interested in food, learning about it. And then it got adopted by the Citrus Growers Association. And they marketed that as like a fantastically healthy way, eat 2 grapefruit a day. Essentially, that was the diet. And then
Sounds awful.
one meal and 2 grapefruit a day, and you're great. But again, so what happens is we have to become savvy consumers, and we always have to be savvy consumers. And that doesn't mean that you have to analyze everything, and it also doesn't mean everything has to be to an extreme. Going back to like family dinners, once a week, start once a week. Sit down and have a good meal that is cooked. And the biggest thing, in my opinion, based on my understanding of both the history and the science that people can do, is start to ignore all of the opinions and the kind of trainers and people who have an angle and what they recommend, and go back to purity, this idea of purity, which is how the food safety laws became passed in 1905, because of there were people putting things into food. That's the infamous, you saw sausages made of sawdust, milk mixed
What?
with chalk and water. And so, because the United States had no rules whatsoever on their foods or drugs, and people died because of it. So it goes back to the idea of purity laws. So when you're eating, when you're making food choices, look at the label, look at the thing. The least amount of ingredients is what you want. That's it. If you that and that's like sometimes people call it clean eating. And so you can follow any trend, and you can be any, whether you're a vegetarian, a vegan, if if you're a carnivore, look at the labels. Do not put lots of chemicals in your bodies. That is the ultimate walk away, is you're going to improve your gut biome, and you're going to improve your overall health if you can cut down on just the amount of processed food, which fundamentally has the most chemical additives to it.
I would say a lot of people are brainwashed when they flip over the back of a package and they see the first thing they look at is the calories, or they look at the carbs, and they're not necessarily looking at the necessary ingredients, like red dyes and all those types of things. I mean, even I could list off 40 different things that are included into a Pepsi or something like that, and I might only know like three of them. I know aspartame's in gum, but it's like seems like that you find that little thing everywhere. And I know people say it's bad for you as well too. And then it just gets into the point where people toss their hands up and be like, you know what? Something's going to kill you eventually. And it's like that type of argument there. And it's like, well, instead of flipping it over and looking at the calories or looking at the sugar content or looking at whatever, unless you're a diabetic, but if you're looking at those first, carbs, fat, all that, that people seem like that's the healthy thing to do. You want to check to make sure you're not getting too many calories, you're not getting too much fat. I'm staying inside my carb ratio, but they're not looking at those ingredients at the bottom. I'm like, okay, well, if something says sugar free, I drink sugar free stuff all the time. It's not, I mean, yeah, it has no sugar in it, but what else are they putting in there to make sure it's not sugar free? So it's like, you look, if I can live to 30, that's fine. But I'm just saying, I think it's important to, when you look at the back of the nutrition label, you should be paying attention to the ingredients. And then you see where the industry messed that up. I mean, that is with the diet trends.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that, regardless of any US legal precedents, corporations are not people, and they are not working in the best interest of humanity. And so, when somebody is telling you something, and it is either it's a doctor and who is paid by a corporation, or even, universities are guilty of this, in this kind of libertarian so-called utopia, is you'll see a lot of university studies, and you're like, oh, that's legitimate. It's from the University of XYZ. It's this doctor. But if you peel back just a little bit more, you'll find that the funding came from a corporate interest, an advocacy group. They're so-called nonprofit advocacy groups, which essentially are these corporations that fund these elements to essentially hide their involvement and use it as a marketing piece to advocate for, their foods, for their positions, to make money. That's ultimately what that is. And it goes back to, I think that there's also a different mindset. I would challenge people to go to almost, let's say, a Little House on the Prairie mindset, late 1800s, thinking about how food is, so the things that we're inundated with every day, the salt, the fat, the sugar, the stuff that really that works on our brains, it kicks in when we eat a lot of sugar. It works on our brain the same way as cocaine does. It fires up the same, parts of your brain. And so we need to think about these things as treats, as someone did, in the 1800s, when we could not access sugared candies all the time, and think about it as a treat. So in the soda pop situation, so if you're drinking sugar-free soda, I would argue, instead of drinking a sugar-free soda and embracing that moderation, and enjoy, if you're a soda pop fan, drink one or two a week and enjoy that. Enjoy the sugar, enjoy the taste of it, enjoy your favorite, even splurge if you have a gourmet kind of fancy soda pop, a locally made fancy soda pop, enjoy that maybe once or twice a week, versus, a six-pack of Diet Coke a day. So that moderation, this idea of, you don't have to eat 100% pure and clean. I would wager really only people in competitive body sports are really concerned where their body is their tool. Would really need to concern themselves with that. Most human beings need to worry about, as you mentioned, the amount of processed food, the amount of chemicals they're taking in, the overall amount of fats and sugars they're taking in, and then look at that salt content too, because Americans are oversalted.
It is the convenience factor. I feel like when I know some people that drink like 2 liters a day, and like they might sit at home and just play video games or might do whatever that is. And these are people that like have families, like that's just their lifestyle. I mean, in their 40s or 50s that are doing that. And I'm like, that's not good. But it is also like they've now adjusted to that lifestyle. They didn't just start off with 2 liters a day. It became one, and then eventually that one became two, and then that two became three. And then it just keeps moving on there. And that's the convenience factor, but also I would blame television shows and movies for whenever there's a sad situation or someone who goes through a heartbreak, a jar of ice cream comes out or a tub of ice cream, and then a bunch of other sweets and desserts. And that's like a stereotype. And it is true. When you feel sad, you want comfort food. That's comfort food. But that's how that kind of all gets fueled as well, too. This idea of here's a comfort food for you, or here's this when you're sad. Well, it's like, man, what's being sad? I mean, you end up, you getting a taste for ice cream. I like Ben and Jerry's, but I haven't had it in like 10 years. But that is the comfort food of choice. That is ice cream, that is cakes, that is sweets, that is something that's going to make you happy.
And so yeah, and it goes back to what I'm saying about scarcity. So what would happen, and this is not movies or television, they're not the cause. Art is a reflection, and what the core issue is advertising and accessibility in these multinational food companies. And so, yes, cake is a treat. Ice cream is a comfort. Ice cream was a rarity. Fourth of July, you got ice cream, and maybe as a treat on your birthday, a fancy party. It was essentially the height of fashion in the Victorian era, up till like the 1910s or 20s, when the revolution of actually indoor freezing, of electricity, of freezers and refrigerators, allowed for people to keep these types of rare foods for longer. And it converged with the modernization of manufacturing and the consolidation, the move away from local food systems to nationwide food systems. And that's the birth of rail, of trucking. All of these things converged, and these companies understood that, as well as this idea of class mobility. Let's not forget that too, because that's part of the marketing, the advertising. Again, to your ice cream example, is again, that was a rare treat, very rare to have. So there was no worry about someone eating, a pint a day, because you didn't have that kind of accessibility. Or if you were making ice cream, that was a lot of labor to make homemade ice cream, as well as accessibility to ice. Again, so we come back about access. So what corporate America did, what they gave people the easy access, like you said, so that easiness of it. And so what foods that were rare now became commonplace. And then the marketing kicked in to push that narrative to say that, this is something that was only available to the wealthy. Now you can have it too. So working classes, and it became this very aspirational push. So that was in, between 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And then you get into this idea that now you have generations of people who grew up eating these things, and it becomes expected. It becomes a habit. And you yourself, you were saying that you work in health industries. Habits are, bad habits are easy to form. Good habits are, much harder to form.
Well, if you look at the fitness industry, I guarantee you can walk through and point at every single person that has a severe mental, I would just say, disorder when it comes to their body or when it comes to their food eating. It's a bodybuilding tactic. I do 4 hours of cardio in the morning. I do it because I feel like, I don't know, I like it, but that's excessive. But also, there's bodybuilding tricks out there where if you would just fast, if you get hungry, instead of going to something to eat, you just pull out a cigarette and smoke it because the nicotine keeps off some of your hunger pains. I mean, that's weird, but that's what you start noticing is like when I started first getting into the industry in general, just working out for the first time 10 years ago, I started noticing that everyone had their own tricks. Hey, grab a spinach leaf. And I used this trick for a while too. If you don't want bread, it's that crunch factor. You grab a spinach leaf, or not spinach leaf, cabbage leaf. And then you put your food inside the cabbage leaf and you roll it up, and it's called raw tacos. And it eliminates that crunch factor. There's a bunch of different weird tricks and tips to try and find ways to make sure you can try and get your body into that peak performance thing. But also there's a lot of severe disorders. I mean, reason I'm wearing a jacket now, reason why people work out and when it's 80 degrees out, they'll be wearing big jackets as well too. It's that body dysmorphia angle. And you start realizing that every single person in this industry, where apparently these people are supposed to be the peak specimens, or they're supposed to be these fitness, gods, whatever you want to say, they're all suffering from something. And that's when you start reeling it back to what we were talking about before, about the gut and the brain connection. The amount of people that are depressed and they go to comfort food, or the amount of people that are trying their best to make sure that they keep their body in peak performance because they feel like that'll make them happier, when really it's also what they're putting into themselves as well too.
It's absolutely what you're putting into your body. And as well as we can call this the, diseases of despair. And our post-industrial revolutionary culture has moved away from, again, nutritive communities, and kind of an acceptance. There's a lot wrapped up into what we eat and how we eat it. And this goes into, mentioned is my next book, what I'm working on now, is about the influence, especially for American food systems and American cuisine, the influence of religion, the influence of religious and morality movements. And a lot of times, if we go back to this Thomas Aquinas and then St. Augustine, about rules for living and rules for morality, this is something that people have been concerned about since there were people. Um, and we come coming to the seven deadly sins. And so what we identify as, and has long been identified as a deadly sin, one of the vices, is gluttony, about eating too much. And so now we've got this moral judgment, this moral component put on food, when food is it's either an animal or it's a plant, and we gain energy from it. At the end of the day, that is ultimately all the reason we eat. Our physical thing, our carcass, needs kcals, it needs energy, and we derive energy from food. Ultimately, that's it. Any other thing that we ascribe to what the food is, whether it's comfort, whether it's, some sort of personality, that's us, that's our brains, and that's our culture, and that's our society placing that on top of the food we eat.
How long do you think Thanksgiving's going to last?
Well, Thanksgiving is a really important political holiday. And so, and it's very important to kind of the American idea. So I don't see Thanksgiving going anywhere, because one of the ways we become American is definitely through how we eat. And Thanksgiving is and was, created, this idea of it's a unifying holiday, is that under this shared meal, because this idea too of feasting, of breaking bread together, of sharing a meal, there's an act of trust that goes through that. If I serve you food, we were talking earlier about food safety, if I serve you food and you eat it, that is an act of trust between two people, that I am not poisoning you, that I'm not going to kill you. Um, so the idea of feasting and sharing a feast together is very much a communal, important social thing to do. And that's why I don't think we'll get rid of Thanksgiving.
About Thanksgiving, it used to be about families sitting down and being able to communicate that social aspect, but I started to notice that change. The reason why I said, do you think Thanksgiving's going to last, is because, I mean, I don't do Thanksgiving. What I do is, I mean, I worked and then I had crab cakes. That was like my little tradition, is having the kind of different food. And everyone always thinks that's weird. And I'm like, well, it's weird that we are all agreeing that we have to get a turkey. And then we all have to agree that it has to be like we just stuff ourselves just because it's Thanksgiving. I'm like, it's just a day though. It's might mean something to more other people, but strictly with my religious friends that are all kind of like, well, no, it's like Thanksgiving, it's a Christian, it's all, and it's like, I don't really
It's not
see that.
Christian.
Yeah. So it's like, I just get into this aspect of like, what is this, the weird things? I mean, even with Christmas, and I'm a very like, holidays are like, but Christmas, I enjoy Christmas. I like giving my presents to nephews and things of that sort. But what's with the gingerbread men? What's with all the, and then you start seeing like the whole sweet factors. And I am a libertarian, or I probably would side more with libertarian. And I don't just blame the establishment for everything, but I also go, that's good advertising. The reason I feel like that has influenced our minds, that we're always dealing with these weird sweets that never come out throughout the rest of the year, but then on these specific holidays happen to be these major monoliths of our society. You're saying no?
No, I'm saying no. I'm disagreeing entirely, because the history of it is, is quite different. This comes back to the idea of feasting and fasting. There is moral and religious components working backwards, and so Thanksgiving itself came out of the idea of feasting, and so a celebration. And so we ascribe it in our American mythology to this religious notion of the Puritans and all that, but every culture in the world has a tradition of fasting to appease a god, uh, whatever god that is, or gods, as the case may be, or and then feasting in celebration when either their good behavior has pleased their god or something great happened to that. You celebrate with food time immemorial. You can go back to the Babylonians, to the first written things are about recipes for feasting, so and foods for feasting. And so along with that, the foods we use to celebrate are the foods that are scarcer, are harder to get, and then they get imbued with a symbolic meaning. So gingerbread, ginger again, comes about 1600s, the beginning of the world exploration era, of the colonial era. The first thing coming back from the ships going from Europe from the east is coming back to the quote Spice Islands, or going through the Indian subcontinent and bringing home foods like ginger, which was rare. That was a spectacular new discovery for the very bland eating Europeans. And because it was rare, it was used to celebrate. In the dark of winter, Christmas in Europe got co-opted because it was long traditionally a pagan holiday, and it got co-opted by Christianity. So we have this midwinter celebration of then at the darkest time of year when people need community more than ever. As we celebrate, we use the rarer foods, gingerbread. So that's why you see it come out only at this holiday time. Turkeys, very specifically, hard. It's a hard bird to raise and to get them to market, and they were ubiquitous wild turkeys in the United States. Actually, Ben Franklin proposed turkeys as the national bird symbol versus eagles. But again, it was a rare commodity to get a turkey, a goose. Our traditions also change over time. They've become stalled in what you're viewing as this, like, it's got to be turkey, it's got to be stuffing, it's got to be like the green bean casserole, which is vile. But I can tell you that was invented by the Campbell's Soup Company. They specifically invented that recipe and pushed it out as like a great celebratory, easy to make celebration dinner, and that became like adopted and used. And so for many people, that is what's on their Thanksgiving table, is that green bean casserole invented by Campbell's Soup my memory's going I think late 40s. And so again, traditions change over time. Traditions in America are weird because they get co-opted and corporatized. But the underlying traditions of feasting and fasting never change.
But don't you think it's open to, I would say, open to any advertiser to be able to capitalize on that? I mean, be able to advert
Absolutely.
that's
Absolutely.
what I
Yeah.
think. Like, I think there's good laws for food. I think the FDA does a pretty good job. I do think that if like there's independent studies, there is a problem with the fact that taking money from one corporation that might be funding might manipulate a study, but that's in various different topics. It's not just food. But when it comes down to the main point of like the laws for food are very, very good. And there are maybe some areas that could need work, but overall it's pretty effective. But the advertising area has been open to be picked by so many corporations. And I feel like they have a lot more power than a lot of people realize. I mean,
They
being able
do,
to
because we're
influence an
not
idea.
really a libertarian democracy. We're not that. Because corporations have so much undue influence and control over our American population. You have to work a little harder to educate yourself about the quality of what you're consuming, and that is due to um, the lack of oversight, as you're saying, to all the corporate manufacturers
And I
and
think
advertisers.
with advertising, I mean, it's so weird now that if you just said soda pop or you said anything, I think so. You say it's soda pop because you're out there in Wisconsin. It's usually soda everywhere
It is
else.
usually soda, but I spend time talking about food so much. So if I say soda, people don't know what I mean. If I say pop, other people don't know what I mean. So I've adopted saying soda pop, so which is very clear what I'm talking about.
I noticed that too. Throughout some episodes, someone would mention pop, and I'm like, "Do you mean soda?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, that's a different culture." And that's weird how there's the same I guess it's the same thing, but it's just two different words for it. But if you mention just soda pop, say name a soda pop, everyone will usually say Coke or Pepsi, and that's just they don't even need to advertise. They're built in like monoliths in our society, and I think that started because maybe they captured the market in the beginning and they became these giant corporations, and now they really don't need to advertise. But they also captured on trends. They captured on Santa Claus. They captured on a lot of things that people were like, okay, now I feel closer to this. Polar bears for a point until the global warming thing kind of kicked up, and they were like, all right, it's making people depressed, and they kind of pushed it off to the side. But that's what, like, to me is interesting. And also I think that influences a lot of decisions the way people buy as well too. I mean, it's like strategic planning in a city. I mean, if you have a liquor store one spot and then right across the street is a Taco Bell, I mean, that's not God saying he wants you to get tacos after you get some beer. It's city planning. It's set up that way.
It's city planning, and more so actually lack of city planning, because corporations have way too much control and the cities actually have very little control into what gets placed. Same thing with advertising on the television. So someone, say a channel, let's call it just a television channel, could make a moral stance and saying, we are not going to show advertising that is XYZ. They could do that. They would lose a lot of money. That's why they don't. So they just take the ads because they're, again, corporations are not people. They don't have a moral sensibility. They don't have a moral compass, and regardless of what they may advertise or promote. So if you go back to the point of like Coca-Cola, which is, if you're in Atlanta, if you say Coke, that's the word for all of soda pop they use. So, if you say, give me a Coke, and then the response is, what flavor? And they're not talking about all the many flavors of Coca-Cola. They're talking about, well, I want a Sprite Coke, I want a Sprite, because the word Coke has been adopted to mean soda pop. Just like, we use a lot of like Kleenex for tissue. That is the success of advertising. Santa Claus specifically, that started an illustration by Thomas Nast that ran in one of the New York papers, I think of the early 1900s, coming out of the German tradition. Again, I'm in Milwaukee. Tonight is St. Nicholas night. St. Nick comes tonight, or Krampus comes tonight to beat the naughty children with sticks or put them in cages. But good children get a stocking, and traditionally, what you would get is an orange, because very rare in Europe, right? They'd only, when the citrus crops would come in on ships, and nuts, again, the fall harvest, that again, a rare commodity, and maybe, one piece of candy, not necessarily chocolate, but just a piece of candy. Again, rare treats around the holiday time to as a reward for good children. So St. Nicholas was kind of morphed into Santa Claus, and that's due to Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is an illustrator working the Coca-Cola company as they were starting, and those, all the soda pops started as health tonics. That originally they weren't marketed, they weren't invented as a refreshing beverage treat. They were, supposed health tonics. And remember, of course, that Coca-Cola, the name derives from, because the earliest version had cocaine in it. So Coca-Cola hired Nast to do illustration, and that's how Santa Claus became affiliated with Coca-Cola. They paid for that, and they paid to have that advertising put into magazines and then on radio and everywhere. So essentially, they bought and then created that marketplace, and that is what successful advertising does.
I just talked about political cartoons and propaganda for a while. And I can't believe that was Nas that did that because his name pops up with the political cartoon
Oh yeah, he
discussion.
brought down Tammany Hall. He was an extraordinary illustrator, but he also essentially invented, the modern illustration. When we see Thomas Nast's first illustration of Santa Claus, that is the first recognizable Santa Claus. Other earlier illustrations showed much more of what we would recognize as Saint Nicholas, but the fat guy in the red suit, yeah, that's Thomas Nast.
What, through all of your research, what was the weirdest thing to you about anything throughout food history?
Um, God, there's so many great weird stuff. There's two that just pop in my head that's semi-related. First of all, that mid-century, and it goes back to, something we were talking about earlier before we started recording, which is Jell-O. So Jell-O, gelatin,
It's animal bones.
yeah, so rendered animal, yes. So because you didn't waste things, because that's the idea, you were starving. This idea, again, refrigeration, food security. This is a modern notion that when people were not actually starving, food didn't keep as long either. So when we see what we call an aspect and Jell-Os, you would put things inside of that, meat juice, for lack of a better term, that gets solidified because of, the gelatin aspect. And so what that does is when you put meat or a vegetable or a fruit encased in a gelatin, it prevents the oxygen from getting there. And so what it does is preserve that food for a few days longer. And if you can eat for another day, if you can make your food supply last 1, 2, 3 days, that means you're not starving. It means you're not out there trying to earn the money or, doing what you have to do to get food. So that was a common thing. And so folks will look at like Victorian or 1910s cookbook and see these extraordinary mountains of, aspects and gelatins. And so of course that's the human nature, is the competitiveness to, make it crazy, make it elaborate. So again, so Jell-O then became, instead of home cooks having to make their own gelatin, the Industrial Revolution able to mechanize that process to essentially extract a powdered version of the gelatin, then add flavor to it. And that's the birth of modern Jell-O. So as these companies grow, they also are competing against other manufacturers. Then there's other food processors that see the synergies between their companies. And so by the 1940s, there's a few companies that own Libby Canning, they own the Jell-O brand, they own Skippy peanut butter, and they owned part of like a mayonnaise company. And so they did their advertising to say, make your Jell-O mold and then use the canned fruit. And so make your peanut butter sandwich with mayonnaise. So what you saw was an artificial construct of taking something that was done by people in history and then kind of went through the corporate lens after the kind of industrial manufacturing. And then they meaning the marketers, advertisers, created something new. And this new thing was familiar enough to the original thing and was much easier to do. If you've ever made like homemade meat gelatin, it's complicated. Um, and so that was that time and place that came about. So the towering Jell-O full of fruit, that's why, because that company really wanted you to eat that, because you could buy then the box of Jell-O and the can of fruit.
Do you think that they broke through the mold of, I guess, specific types of people that eat Jell-O? Like, I would think if you mention Jell-O or you bring it, kids are introduced to that, and maybe elderly people because of like some teeth. I didn't get interested into it, but it's a diet trick. At Food Lion, they'd have a bag of Jell-O, and after doing like 4 hours of cardio, you burn 2,000 calories. The Jell-O that I would get was 45 calories on the back, but it had 8 grams of protein in it. And I'm like, how does that happen? And but that it was a filler food. It was like this weird idea out there, and it's not even an idea, it's real. It's just volume. If you fill up your stomach with low calorie but a lot of volume, you won't be hungry. You won't have to worry about consuming more calories, and you can keep the ones that you burned off. It's a diet trick, like I said, fitness industry. But that was it. Was like eat a bag of Jell-O after doing all that excessive amount of cardio. It's not good for your muscles and recovery, but it definitely kept off the hunger thing. And I started going like, why am I like I'm the only people would ask me, you're like 20 years old, why are you eating Jell-O? You're not old, you have all your teeth. And it's like, yeah, it's like, well, I like Jell-O. It's a good diet trick. But you start realizing, okay, it's introduced to kids and then it's introduced to elderly people. Do you think they broke that mold of like everybody? Because I know holidays, someone breaks out something with Jell-O, that's fine. But I mean, the average person, is it going to be something that's going to be added to their accessory at the dinner table?
Well, so this is also about feminism, because it's so oh yeah. So primary, we talk about running a household, okay, in say the 1920s, 1910s, prior to refrigeration, when you're still on maybe a wood stove. Modern can all mod cons, right? The modern conveniences. So being a housewife running that was a big job. It took a lot of work. That's a long day. As women started moving into the workforce especially during World War II, and then in depression first and then World War II, is women were less available to do that work at home. And so the modern corporations took advantage of that, and again, the convergence of the understanding of processing, the mechanical abilities, and then the rise of advertising, to say you can have the same quality of food at home, but here's a trick to make it go faster. So you get Wonder Bread, right? Because instead of baking a loaf of bread every day, here's a bag of bread. It has so many chemicals in it, it's never going to rot. So, those are the modifications. Jell-O comes under that too. So you could, Jell-O wasn't always made as a treat, and that's where the advertising comes in to change the perspective of it. If you grew up in the 70s like I did, Jell-O was really common. It wasn't also pre-made. You had to make it, so it was a bit of a treat. And it was also convergence, and you're talking about how to keep your calorie consumption down. Whereas if you looked at food writing and like especially geared towards women, because those were the primary food makers, um, it's always about increasing caloric content because there was more manual labor jobs. People in factories, whether you're working on farming, you weren't worried about keeping your kcal count under 1,500 for the day. You were worried about getting it up to 3,000 for the day. And so a lot of the foods that were introduced and marketed had ways to increase the kcal count. So the tradition of having a dessert every night, right? So if you look at old movies or anything, it was dessert every night because again, you're striving to get that kcal count up. Um, the food itself then changes with all this chemical addition, vitamin fortifying, all of this garbage. And then again, the perspectives shift. We're no longer working as hard as we did. We're not doing the physical manual labor. We need less calories overall. And then the food and the marketing shifts that. Now you get the sugar-free additives and all of those things. So again, the culture shifts about who is eating Jell-O for what reasons. It used to be an easy thing. It started as a way to preserve your food. It became an easy thing. The original early flavors of Jell-O still marketed towards people who were working to preserve their food. There was a tomato flavored Jell-O. There was celery flavored Jell-O. A lot of times when people see old ads of the like where it's like tuna fish and peas in a Jell-O, and they'll see it green and our minds immediately go to that it's lime, but it's not. It's actually celery flavored Jell-O in that recipe.
I want
So
to
then,
yeah, look
yeah,
at
I
it.
know it's the cat. So that changes about the perspective. Having desserts every day, and that would include Jell-O because it was easy to do. When we're worried about getting the kcal counts up, kind of goes out of fashion when we as a culture don't eat as much dessert anymore because we don't really require that much kcal. So it's about also food trends as well.
I think with Jell-O, I mean, if you look at the various flavors they got now, they got s'mores, they got all these, and they've made it more of a dessert type thing now. I mean, it was a dessert kind of thing before, but also had other purposes as well. But now they actually have flavors like s'mores, they have graham cracker, they have marshmallow, they have a bunch of stuff to make it more appealing taste wise. Because whenever you think of taste, you don't really think off the top of your head of Jell-O. You kind of think more of an aspect of other foods as well too, and it goes into what are they doing to make that Jell-O kind of taste like that. I mean, I like it. I mean, I wish I could remember some of the food history a long time ago. I used to study, or I used to do a couple podcasts on like Wonder Bread or the invention of sliced bread, the invention of the Slurpee. And there's a couple other ones out there as well too. And they all had such a fascinating history behind it where I was like, how come this isn't like taught? Like this would be something that you would get like surprising facts and it would just pop up in a bulletin. But that's like, I mean, people went to war over salt. And people don't see that now. They go, add some more salt on my steak or something like that. I'm like, people used to die for that thing that you're just casually just spraying or throwing over your shoulder. And that to me is interesting.
Well, it's all quite interesting because it goes into I think that the point I seem to be making again is things that were once scarce and had high value through modern industrial understanding and chemistry and corporate interference and advertising have now become ubiquitous. So the flavors of Jell-O, even in my lifetime, Jell-O itself has changed from, you see it in the boxes to make, but more often you'll see it pre-made in a cup where it's like an instant, just eat it now. I didn't have that as a kid, and that's something that, has come later. And again, it then I think one of the damages done for like your generation and generations to follow is then that lack of connection to the food. So you're talking about Wonder Bread, where, folks grew up with just Wonder Bread. They don't even understand that there's a different kind of bread or many kinds of bread, or where your people came from in different parts of the world use different types of grains to make bread. And so it's that disconnect from understanding food because we're not really making food. A lot of times we're just eating it or warming it up. And so I'm a fan of kids, especially, is getting their hands dirty and visiting farms and kind of working a little bit with some getting back to the land, so to speak, and understanding where the food comes from and what is involved in getting it from wherever it originated to your mouth.
I'm surprised when there's like these trends now where, I mean, if you go over to a family member's house, I remember when I was a kid and used to go over to another person's house and I was like, wait, we all don't eat the same. Like they just had a whole different dinner selection. They had a lot of different food in their pantries. I don't eat a lot of pizza. I don't eat spaghetti or stuff like that, but that was like their commonplace. I mean, mine was always like tacos, or it was something that was never really American style. It was usually something else, despite when people say, well, tacos could be American, at least Americanized version, I would say. But that was just something I never had burgers or any of that type of meat stuff in the house. It was usually fish stuff. It was usually exotic stuff or things that, weren't common American household foods. They were always like, you would have a specific night for it. And then it had me wondering, like, okay, so if all people don't eat the same, you start going to other family members' houses, you start realizing they don't eat the same. You start realizing people that you work with don't eat the same. And now there's a trend where people go, bring your cultural dish. And it's people that are inspired to know what their cultural roots are. I have a friend that's Philippine and he makes Philippine food all the time. And I'm like, well, make some for me. And I had some delicious. And it's like trying to understand that culture. Then you kind of look into it a little bit more. And I think that's taken off at least today.
I agree with you, and I think it's actually it's lovely. It it become I actually say the line in the new book is we become Americans through our stomachs because America, the United States, is so unique. Is there are other definitely countries in the world that are essentially amalgamated colonist immigrant societies, but the United States more so in so much is that how we adopted everything. We're consummate cherry pickers, whether it's in our history of or our religion, and especially in our food. So I would merit that there's some pushback in food writing about authenticity. Who has the right to talk about, say, Philippine cuisine? Um, and what's interesting to me is how then things become Americanized. And you mentioned like with tacos um tacos, northern Mexican, poor people food, right? Easy to, traveler food, and that's great, but it's delicious. And so we have an instinctual as human beings to seek out pleasure. We want, and this is that the gut brain connection, we want our brains, those endorphins, to fire. And so when we eat foods that give us pleasure, and the food does give us pleasure, we want more of it. And this is also comes into the some of the, I mentioned earlier, the religious aspects about denial, about fasting, about what we should enjoy and what we shouldn't enjoy. It's very famously for any kids, and I'm not sure if kids today are doing it, if they grew up in a Catholic tradition of the Lent season, the Lenten season coming up to Easter, it's traditional to give something up, that a fasting, it's essentially a mini fast. And most kids give up candy, give up sweets. You're supposed to, become morally stronger by giving up the thing that brings you joy. And so this goes into there are different types of cuisines that come to the United States and then get morphed and changed. Originally, when we go back and you talk about Thanksgiving, the English that came here were unable to cook the way they had in back in England or in the Netherlands, where they actually were for a long time, um, because the core ingredients weren't here. We had different, the indigenous agriculture was different. And so when we think about wheat today, that is imported. Americans imported that over what the native grains were. And so this is how it changes and how that food changes. And I'm sure if you talk to your friend, he may and ask him about his recipes and ask him then what he had to change or substitute to make that same dish here in the United States. And so, and sure, there's import grocery stores and you can get imported, say, Philippine ingredients. But if he had to make that just with American sourced material, would he be able to cook the same dish? And then he probably could, but he'd make substitutions. And that is, again, how we become American and how our food becomes American. And so, why people eat differently in different houses. We have so many different advertising and cultural and corporate inputs, that I think it's overwhelming for many people to try to like tease out, how did I learn about Little Debbie snack cakes? Why do I like those over Star Crunches? Why do I like eating,
The Star
fish this
Crunch.
way? Oh, that's another Little Debbie little product.
Oh, I only
So
know
there's,
about like zebra cakes and the Nutty Buddy things.
yeah, Nutty Buddy. Star Crunches were, I think, like kind of a Rice Krispie with caramel kind of concoction.
I miss being like young when I was able to like eat a whole bag of Doritos in one sitting and then not like gain any weight. And then like now, if I even thought about it, I would just get no. I actually haven't eaten chips in probably almost 10 years. Like I said, that bag of Dorito things is real. I did that. And then when I was running on the treadmill the first time I ever started working out, I was sweating spicy nacho. So I just got so disgusted that I literally get physically ill when I walk by like a chip aisle. And it's like that with cinnamon too. I had a bad experience with cinnamon. And now whenever I smell cinnamon, I'm like, nah, this is not like October's the worst. I can't go buy a coffee place.
So what's interesting is that we become overexposed to things, and that's also that's our brain. That's our brain. The Doritos, and they're manufactured that way. They have a lot of fat and the salt, and there's sugar in it too. And sometimes people like eat like chips and that kind of snacky food, and they don't realize how much sugar is actually in it because it's made to make your brain, that lizard part of your brain is going more, 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 more. And people do. You'll eat the whole bag, and then you will feel sick later because your body is not really optimized to process all of that sugar and fat and salt and chemicals. And so you will feel ill. That is your body giving you the signal saying too much,
Do you
too
all
much.
It's also in part I would bring up the point of maybe because it's kind of like a goal, which is like if they give you a bag of chips, most people finish the bag, and it's just because it's about like it's like this idea of finishing something. I started noticing that as well too. Usually, if I was eating something, it was just how much Clean Plate Club was a lifestyle my grandparents lived by, and you weren't leaving the table until you finished your plate. So that's like a major thing where it comes into now bags of chips. I mean, whenever I see something, I go, can I eat all of that? If I can't, I'm not going to get it because it's like, are you going to save it? Like people get a whole pizza and they save some, and it's yeah, that's good maybe the next day or something. But when it comes to like how much you're putting on your plate, I mean, more people when they order out, they end up finishing their meal. Not, I don't, I mean, maybe they'll take some home, but usually it's like a sweeter dessert. I don't actually see them taking home like a taco or other things of that sort. I would finish 3 tacos right in front of me, even though might only be hungry for one, but it's because it was placed in front of me.
Yeah, and that's one of our human instincts is to, food in our primordial, our lizard brain, we are programmed that food is scarce, especially foods with salt and fat and sugar. Those are the scarcity items. And so back to, the earliest of the dawns of civilization, when human beings would find things with salt and fat and sugar, we would just gorge on it because it was so rare to find and it was so valuable to our systems. And again, now that it's everywhere, our lizard brain still thinks it's rare, which is why we overconsume on those things. Now, and again, so the marketing and the corporate and the advertising aspect of it comes into, when you go to a low quality food joint and you, as you mentioned, go to a restaurant, they're going to overserve you because that, you get, people will eat it all and they feel that, oh, that was a good value. I ate myself till I felt like I couldn't eat anymore. And so that was worth my, $5. Whereas if you go to say like, more of it, let's call it like a fancy French restaurant, right? So you're going to see much
Olive
smaller.
Garden, Olive Garden.
Oh,
That's
no.
fancy to me. I'm poor. I don't know we don't
Well,
have
I
any
mean,
good
but
plates.
see, this is the difference. Fancy doesn't have to be expensive.
Hmm.
It doesn't. But I'm just showing you like the idea of like a French. Just say is my point is that you're going to get a higher quality that's a focus on like the protein and then vegetables, lots of vegetables, and then maybe a very small petit um, dessert because again it's more balanced to the macros, which people actually before they discovered calories understood macros. And so the value is that the much smaller portion sizes but a higher quality of food. And I think, and that's the mistake that Americans make. We go for volume. If it's an old joke of like, how is the food? It was terrible and there wasn't enough of it, right? So we value volume over quality.
I'm smiling because the your reaction you had when I said Olive Garden was the same reaction. Someone I took on a first date when they asked if you want to go somewhere romantic, I was like Olive Garden. It was the same exact reaction. I was like, look, those garlic sticks will make you feel like you're in Italy. Uh, but that's maybe because that's when I was raised, every time we went out somewhere, it was like an Olive Garden. It was those small places that I mean, budget obviously, but then it was ingrained into me like that's fancy. Maybe it was the way that the place was set up, the atmosphere of the thing as well. So which honestly, as I got older, I miss going out to eat. I used to do that all the time when I was a kid, and now like my grandparents, like they're not like, they're older, but it's not like they're not going to be around forever. And I was like, "Damn, I want to take you guys out and do this family thing that we used to do." Because back then I did not appreciate it, and that's that atmosphere aspect of things where you're actually sitting down and eating with your family, whether it's at home or not. But just there is something about going out. I won't rag on it too hard because you get a different connection than you are at your house. I mean, either a TV's on in the background or, it's just a different feeling.
Turn the TV off. Turn it off. Eat your meal, even if it's in silent contemplation if you're alone, or, try to host, even if it's the simplest dinner you're making, invite a friend over. There is such joy in we become more human when we share food. And it goes back to you were saying earlier about like your grandparents and the clean plate club. And again, this idea of more. When people were starving, and that's a cultural memory. We call it what, epigenetic memories of starvation. That's a thing that's being studied right now too, that we can find DNA evidence of traumatic experiences that are remembered in the body, starvation being a very specific one that's been studied. Is that so even someone whose grandparents had experienced a prolonged, at least like 30 days amount of physical starvation, that memory of it will be passed along in that DNA. And then also the cultural memory of it, right? So if you had a grandparent, which I'm giving a sharing example from a friend who their grandparents were in the Holocaust, were survived the Holocaust. And any family meal was a legitimate celebration of life, was a feast. And it became this source of pride and this cultural thing to be able to say, I'm giving you this much food because I didn't have it. And I want you to eat this food with joy because it was made with joy, because we're celebrating this life and we're going to indulge. And so there's this mindset then, fulfilling caloric requirements that are no longer required, to cultural memories, to epigenetic memories. So these are all the things that get baked in, if I can make the bad pun, into how we view food as a culture, and how this all gets passed along. Even the ideas of what you're thinking about is Olive Garden being fancy. And yeah, I grew up working class. Is we growing up, we didn't go to restaurants. It's not something that poor people did, except like McDonald's, like once or twice a year. Going to McDonald's was a really great thrill. And as a kid, I have very fond memories of that. In hindsight, of course, is that food high quality nutritive food? No, not at all. But the value of that, spending time together, as a family, as a treat, that in itself is valuable. So your Olive Garden memories are really good, and you should enjoy going to Olive Garden as a fond experience, but also know that that is not the highest quality of food, and that you could get higher quality food for probably about the same amount of price. But I never want to diminish anybody's like joyful memories of the experience, because that is also part of eating, is about, again, that social, that shared experience, and our memories of the foods that comfort us and bring us joy.
There, I'm gonna go into the different generational, I guess, experiences of food. But I'm gonna ask you as well, if you could think of a good family or a good moment with food in your life, like one that you always remember all the time. It could be a good one. You could share a bad one as well too. Um, I was gonna mention an experience. My great grandfather grew up in the Depression, and we're kind of. I mean, he lives a couple states away, Baltimore. I live in actual Maryland, so it's about a 3 hour drive. So it's not easy. I mean, I guess it's easy, but if you're like 12 years old, you can't drive up to his house all the time. But when I would go over there, he'd be like, "You want some dinner?" And I was thinking, okay, it must be like how my grandparents eat. We going out to like Applebee's, or we go out something like that. He's like, he goes and gets a bucket of chicken at KFC, and then I'm watching this guy eat chicken, and he's sucking on the bone, like pulling out every little bit of chicken meat. And he taught me how to eat chicken like that. And even when I do it on my friends, I go, that's weird. I go, look, man, I was like, if you have one chicken wing on your plate, and he goes, yeah, but you're not in a depression. You don't need to worry about doing what, your great grandfather did. I was like, well, that's how he did it. And that's how you would get another piece is you had to follow his exact thing. So you get this like kind of like understanding of like, oh my God, you grew up in a different time. And I mean, a really different time where me and him, like, and I'm, it doesn't have to be anything about money, but I'm happy that I actually socialize or I accept memory wise that a good fancy place is something like what people would call like a chain or something like that, not something like a high class $200 dinner, because the best memories I've had have been from some of those small rinky dinky spots in a way. And I mean, going to KFC and him like a giant smile on his face, like, dude, we're set. And it's like, okay, that was happiness to him, and that brings happiness to me. I think about it all the time when I drive past the KFC. I mean, it sucks to have a memory for a business like that, like capitalists, but it's that meaning or what that was. I mean, going to Taco Bell before they merged with KFC is me and my dad used to do that all the time. Something quick. My dad was only home 3 hours a night. He was like, let's get a taco 12 pack and we'll split it. I mean, it also probably led to my childhood obesity because I used to eat like a pint of Ben and Jerry's every day, which is not good.
No, and this is and again, it's about, are we using food for, the wrong purposes? And so we like feasting, fasting, and health and energy. And it goes back to that. So our food memories and our joyous food memories, I never judge how they come about. It's because most of the time it's not always about the food itself, it's about the people we shared that food with. That is the critical thing. You asked me what one of my favorites is that so my father died when as a relatively young age, and he was a machinist working third shift. That's a miserable kind of work. We have a local chain that's still around today called George Webb's, and it's a diner joint. Burgers, fries, soups, sandwiches, that kind of thing. And they were always open 24 hours. And it didn't always happen, but sometimes dad would stop at the Webb's and they had a special called a bag of burgers. And you got a bag of 7 hamburgers for $5 and a bag of fries. They could get an extra bag of fries for like $2. And he'd come home from work at like 8 in the morning with a bag of cheeseburgers and French fries. And the kids, that's what we'd eat for breakfast. And dad, and in hindsight and later, he was getting his own dinner, but knew that there was a pack of hungry kids at home. And so so that shared memory of those Webb's cheeseburgers and fries and eating it in the morning with dad is a very favored food memory. And the same thing, it's because of the circumstance and who we spent it with that makes it so personally important to me.
Yeah, the food memory thing. I know there's the cultural memory, and then there's the personal memories as well. So, I mean, have you ever had breakfast for dinner?
Oh, all the time.
It's great.
All the time, a very working class thing. And I'll tell you, there's a reason for this too. Eggs are cheap. Eggs are a cheap form of protein. And so again, if you're, cash strapped and you're, time strapped, it's pretty easy to scramble up some eggs too and make, so that's a pretty good meal actually if you analyze it. So maybe you're not getting a lot of vegetable matter, and as long as you're not leaning heavy on the like syrup and pancake side, but maybe a little potatoes, some eggs, piece of toast, that kind of, breakfast for dinner, that's a pretty good, well-rounded, hits the calorie marks, hits the protein marks really well. It's a good amount of carb without being bad carb, too bad. So, I mean, that's a good healthy meal.
Do you put ketchup on your eggs?
Nope, I am not a ketchup
All
person.
right, good. I don't either. I said this a long time ago in my show. It's been like a constant. It's a Baltimore thing, especially, but it's also very common in Canada, which is eggs and ketchup. But also, like if you live in Maryland, it's Old Bay on everything, which is like crabs are basically what we're
Yeah.
known for.
So Wisconsin is it's kind of sometimes us Northerners are called like Canada Light, so we get a lot of ketchup on eggs too. I am anti-ketchup because most ketchups are just pure sugar, and if you look historically what ketchup is, I've done it because I'm also a food preservationist. If you look at the very earliest recipes for ketchups, George Washington had his own favored ketchup recipe. Um, it is actually more akin to like what is called a chutney. It's more similar to that. Its roots are actually from Indonesia. And if you made a homemade ketchup to these older recipes, It's incredible. Not a lot of sugar in it, lots of spices. And sure, you can use a tomato base and any homemade ketchup, none of it is bright red. That is all red dye number two. Um, but it's a fantastic sauce. So if somebody is really anti-ketchup, I would say try making homemade ketchup and the lights will go off and it's a life changer.
Well, it's usually whenever you mention like an American food, if someone brings up a cheeseburger, they want ketchup on it. If you bring up like a hot dog, they want ketchup on it. And that's the picture of like the ball game thing. Is like it's a hot dog. It could be plain, but most of the time it's ketchup or it's mustard or it's or not mayonnaise, it's relish or something on it. And every single time. And I mean, like, I'm the only one that eats stuff plain. I like it very, very simple, very, very like not a lot of stuff added onto it. And it's not even for health reasons. I just think it tastes better, if you actually cook it right. My dad would be like, I know it's bad when you dump ketchup all over it. And I was like, yeah, you burned it. It doesn't taste good. But that's a way that you can kind of get through. I mean, it's a good convenient hacks, I would say, if you don't want to be rude about someone's cooking.
Sure. And again, it's, this goes back to what we were talking about corporations and marketing. If you were a housewife, in the early 1900s, you would be making your own ketchup. Or if you're living in a city, there's usually like a neighborhood grocer, a neighborhood deli that would have like a specialty maker where you get these, now would be called artisanal. But a specialty maker, and that's how like Hellman's started. Richard Hellman, Hellman's mayonnaise started as in New York. Um, and it, just a guy figured out the right ratios and used some of the canning science that was coming about, the understanding of pasteurization, of pathogens, and figured out the right way to make mayonnaise that could be sold and saved for a while. Whereas before Hellman, if you wanted mayonnaise, that was something you made every few days. Again, a rarer item. But he figured out how to jar it essentially, and that made it easier. And when something is easier to obtain, it becomes then used more and it becomes ubiquitous. Same thing with Heinz and ketchup. The Heinz, people, they took a ketchup recipe, and if you compared the taste profile and the ingredient profile of like early Heinz from let's say the 30s to Heinz now, it would be vastly different because of the number of chemical additives to it, where it becomes just kind of it's a sugar sauce is what it is.
So when I ask this, I'm not being sexist in saying this, but when it comes to housewives, I have to ask about martinis. Is that that's a real like historical cultural thing? Because my grandma, that's what she always talked about, being a housewife, drinking martinis all day. And I've heard that from a bunch of other grandparents. I don't know if that's a normal thing or if there's just an issue in my family with alcoholism, but I'm just asking the question because I mean, that's what I was given the answer for was like that was a normal thing, housewives would drink a little bit or they would do something like that, but it was specifically martinis. It wasn't anything like hardcore liquor, it was just martinis.
So I can answer that question. I can give you some food history on drinking. So American drinking, Americans drink a lot. So does everybody else in the world. We all drank more again, prior to the 1900s. It's about water potability. We make an assumption that clean water is easily accessible when prior to mechanization, it was not. The ideas of water filtration systems, not, and I'm talking at a city level, like with the water fact, this is all new inventions. And so the easiest way to get your hydration and when you're not sure about potable water is you distill it, you ferment it. And because the good bacteria in a fermentation, i.e., beer, wine, or distillation, taking, essentially a fermented start and then distilling it to increase the alcohol amounts, that gets rid of the pathogens, that kills the germs. And so there's even something it used to be called small beer. It had maybe about 2 to 3% alcohol, and that's what was given to children. And again, it was so you could get your hydration and safely without dying from, cholera or whatever other, amoeba or pathogen is living in that water. So that comes out. So we have this drinking culture in the United States from, 1600s. It goes, you've heard the story, Johnny Appleseed, right? Everybody, Johnny Appleseed. Oh, the man who brought apples. What kind of cider apples? He was making cideries. He was spread the idea of cider fermentation throughout the United States, the Ohio Valley and all the West, because you couldn't drink the dang water. And so already we've got this culture of drinking. Prohibition comes based on religion, right? So that's this Protestant moralism that comes through, bans alcohol. The easiest alcohols to make at home to distill: gin, vodka. Those are the easiest. Um, and so then a culture of gin drinking and clear alcohols comes up. So when you get to 1950s, so repeal of prohibition, there's a cultural taste. People enjoy gin. Why gin? Aromatics, lots of herbs. It kind of masks the alcohol-y taste. So a gin and tonic, that's a great drink. Tonic, quinine in it, that was very popular in India, kind of the idea of a gin and tonic that was kind of brought by British soldiers. Again, helps prevent malaria. So the idea of culturally gin and tonics, yeah, that's what people drank. It came out of lack of potability for water, then prohibition, cultures of drinking, tastes for gin and other drinks. And that was part of the culture. We were a drinking culture. And that's, of course, it's faded a bit with the idea of, drinking in excess is bad, but that's what we do in the United States. We do everything to excess.
I mean, also, I mean, if they look at the number of things that should be illegal, I wouldn't say drinking, but caffeine. I mean, I like caffeine. I mean, I don't really get a buzz off of it, but that is one of the main profit motivators of this country right now is running off of coffee, running off of energy drinks, running off of anything that really, I mean, chocolate has a small amount of caffeine in it, but I mean, that's just how our society is built right now is, it's a drug. To me, it's a drug. It's a major stimulator, and a lot of people can't function without it. I know people that get migraines if they don't have caffeine. And that's dangerous, but that is also one of the main things of our society. I mean, it's not even an age restriction. They say on energy drinks 18, but I've seen so many kids walk around with energy drinks that are obviously not 18. And I'm just like, I don't think they're following that rule very strictly.
Well, again, it goes back to corporations are not people, and they have a lot of outsized power over people. And so when you talk about things like a regulation, who's going to enforce it? Unless a regulation or a rule is enforced, it's kind of useless. And so when we think about what gets classified as a drug, what gets classified as a food, remember FDA, Food and Drug Association, because early on when the original drug purity laws and food purity laws were passed beginning in 1905, food and drugs were considered the same. They were under the same aegis, and most drugs were derived from plants. So it was thought that these are the same things. We're putting plants and animals into our bodies, and so. But again, the outsized power of advertising and corporations has totally mitigated what we consider food and what we consider drugs. If I personally were czar of the world, I would ban energy drinks altogether. I can't. There do so much damage to a human organism. They
Sound like my
just
doctor.
yeah, no, it's just terrible for you. If you had an actual chemist, which we have a friend who's a chemist, if you look at the can, the side of a can, it's essentially the equivalent of drinking a formaldehyde or paint thinner. I mean, it's that bad for you. I'm I'm not to be an alarmist, but stop sooner than later because your guts will thank you. There's
I'm trying. I just got off coffee, but my doctor called me. He was like, "What's up with your vitamin B?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "It's like way more. I think an average range was between, oh, I think it was 160 and 250 or something like that. And I was at 1500." And he was like, "How are you getting that?" And I was like, I mean, I fasted to do the thing, so I didn't take energy drinks for that. But he was like, "What are you drinking? What are you eating?" And I just listed off what I ate. And he goes, "It's not any of that. What are you drinking?" And I go, and I said 8 energy drinks. He's like, "What?" And I'm like, "Yeah." So I don't know. I mean, like I said, I don't get the caffeine buzz for it, so maybe it's doing less damage to me, but
no, it's not.
oh,
It's not. I promise you, it's not.
try to make myself feel better.
I know, but and again, it's the old George Oscar Wilde quote of moderation in all things, including moderation. So the idea is a little bit of all these like natural plant based. So caffeine plant based, a little bit fine. It's when we go to excess that our human organism starts to get out of balance. The long-term effects, and that's sometimes the danger. I'm 50, going to be 54 soon, and so there's natural wear and tear, and you feel the effects of choices made when you're much younger, choices made for you in childhood, as well as choices you start making as a young adult. And you see that those sometimes the cumulative effect of the choices you make when you're younger do not manifest until you are 25, 35 years later. One of the things that they've studied with just kind of the chemical additives in general, not just specifically energy drinks, is your liver essentially is like it's the filter. It's your body's filter system. And so anything that's like kind of considered, there are lots of food items, plant-based food items and meat-based food items that, you know, they're good. They're good for us. They serve our organism in small quantities, but in large quantities they become toxic. And that's where that's manifested in the liver. So that goes to say for alcohol, of course, for example, a little bit, it's fine. It's good in many cases. Like a red wine can be good for you. There can be positive outcomes, but too much, of course, we know that it can irrevocably harm the liver. It does that too with and over a vitamin B will it kind of build up in your liver and can do.
Cirrhosis.
So yeah, it does different types of liver damage. Different organs will absorb where you see like so too much sugar. I mean, and way too much, you'll see pancreatic damage. So again, it's the cumulative effect. And so that's why I'm a fan of a good 80% rule, because we're still human beings. We still have our lizard brains. And when we come across cake, we may want it, whether it's made of Jell-O or frosting. We want cake because our lizard brains want that fat and sugar and salt. So a little bit. It's always that challenge of just doing it a little bit, and making good choices for our economic restraints and our time constraints. So I'll give you a good example. A lot of times people will say, well, I don't have time to eat vegetables or greens. I just don't have time to think about that, mess with it. And so there are corporate examples of where it can be good. I'd be very wary about bag salad. That's super convenient, but it's also very prone to foodborne illnesses, listerias, and other types of bacteria.
I got salmonella off a box of Honey Smacks. You tell me how that happens.
Oh, I can tell you exactly how that happened.
I was
They,
like,
the, yeah. But so I mean, so that's the drawback. But just even steaming vegetables, add a little real butter. That's a really great flavor. Add a little pepper. Those are great flavors. And again, it's the idea of a little bit is good, is not going to hurt you. A butter, we know what's in it. Versus saying, I can't believe it's not butter. You look at that, it's a lot of just oils and chemicals. So again, the least amount of ingredients in any kind of thing you're eating, even if it's a convenience food. So like for example, like for the vegetables, you can buy frozen vegetables. There's nothing wrong with frozen vegetables, and steam them, warm them up, and eat some vegetables. Eat your protein, but try to stay away from the processed stuff.
I eat relatively clean. I don't really eat like chips or any dirty foods, and I always eat vegetables. But one thing that I do eat that you would think would be a healthy food, but actually is bad for you as well. It's good, but you got to be careful with it as well. It's just cans of tuna. I That's a main fitness thing. It's a cheap snack, especially if you're on a budget and all the
Super
years of
protein, lots of good protein.
but that mercury content. When I went to my doctor, he's like, you got to be careful with mercury poisoning because that's like a real thing. And then you list off like the thing. I'm like, this is why people give up when it comes to any of the diet stuff, when it comes to any of it, because it's like, what are they going to do? I mean, something eventually is going to get you in the end. Everyone knows that, but it's also the complicatedness of everything. And also how I mean, the best thing possible for us to do, if we could somehow get advertisers to stop, manipulating the media and all that so much when it comes to these food products. I get it, it's business. I really do. But I think you'll have more people interested in learning more about it when they're not being shoved images of people on a boat partying and then there's a white claw or there's just certain things where it's like you're not given anyone that wants to get healthy a chance. Like if somebody goes on YouTube and looks up a video how to eat clean and it's a guy giving you a kitchen tutorial or something like that, the advertisement's McDonald's and the next advertisement's Burger King. So it's like, what are you doing? I mean, eventually people don't want to sit through a minute ad because they can't skip it anymore. And they just go, I'm going to turn my phone off. And next thing you know, they're driving and go, oh, there's Burger King. Well, it was already in your head before. So it's like, that's the thing is like, I don't want people to give up on that aspect. I'm also not fighting the fight of like, I'm an activist for eating healthy. I am, but not in the sense of like, you need to change your diet now, but it takes time. And I also think with, slow modifications, I would say just to our everyday lifestyles, it's relatively simple to, be able to expand your life out a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree, and again, small changes. That's why people should strive towards 80%. 80% of eating, just conscientious choices is, I think, and this is where advertising can be just insidious, is that how it knows what it's doing. It knows how it's working on your brain. So it can kind of override the systems that saying, oh, I'm going to plan my dinner. I'm going to, we're going to have spinach and we're going to have a really nice, chicken, a baked chicken tonight, and we're going to have a little potato. Just really simple. That'll be lovely. And then your day goes on and you become busy because American culture is about being, we're not, must be productive. There's the cult of productivity. And so we don't make that a priority. And then you get the advertising, as you're mentioning, the back of your head. It's much easier to go, to a drive-through and just do that. That simplicity, that ease becomes an overriding factor. And so making different choices does require a little brain power. It has to be a choice. But again, I agree that making small modifications. So if everybody listening made a pledge to say, we're going to try to eat dinner once a week and we're going to cook it from scratch ish. Ish is always a good word to think. So if you get, even if you bought like, the skinned already white chicken breasts frozen, great, good, that's fine. You don't have to go and slaughter your own chicken. You don't have to go that far. But cook dinner once a week at least. Eat it with the people that you enjoy eating with. I never say eat with your family because sometimes the family is not really a joyful experience. So eat with people who bring you joy. You'll find it aids your digestion. You'll actually feel more nourished by that food. Take a walk about after 15 minutes after you eat, go take a walk around the block. There's that old Victorian idea of the post dining, it's called a preprandial, which is a fancy word to mean after dinner walk. Now, studies have shown that if you just take a short walk within, like, I'm just talking like 10 minutes after dinner, your systems, the brain, the body, the gut, everything starts working better. You actually digest your food better, with less kind of strain on the other organs. And you just feel better because the body, the system, everything is working together. And that is an optimized human experience with food.
Well, Miss Ward, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. I really do enjoy the conversation I had with you. Is there a place where people can find your links and anything else you'd like to promote as well?
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a delightful conversation. I like that we covered so many different topics about food. People can find out more about me and my work on my website, ChristinaWard.net. And my latest book called Holy Food will be coming out probably in spring of this year. Otherwise, you can look for American Advertising Cookbooks, How Corporations Taught Us to Love Spam, Bananas, and Jell-O. And that's widely available at wherever your preferred book purchase location.
Have you ever had spam musubi?
Spam and Snoopy?
Spam musubi.
Oh, I have.
It's delicious.
It's a little too fatty for me. Here's my last thing is I'm a vegetarian not by choice, and this is something we didn't talk about. So when we talk about things that change all the time, I have alpha gal, which is a tick-borne from ticks. So if you get tick diseases, that is a meat allergy protein, meat protein allergy that you can develop, and it's becoming more and more prevalent. So when we talk about the changeability of how Americans eat, watch this space. That is the next thing that to take a look for. That's going to be the biggest change to how Americans eat is how our different pathogens are going to change our bodies and change what and how we can eat.
Well, I do appreciate the time you gave me to talk, and I'll make sure to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.